Today we're talking to Ben Loftis of Harrison Consoles down in Nashville, and today specifically we'll be speaking about Mixbus version 3, their latest version. Now, Harrison Consoles has been around for many years in the recording industry, and 20 years ago they began a new path to doing high-end film, and they have taken a lot of that market, producing very high-end consoles for recording, but they're exploring some of their past now in working with Mixbus. It's a digital audio workstation that sounds like the old recordings from the 70s and 80s. Has a great sound, excuse me, and we're going to talk about version 3 of that today. Ben, if you want to come in and let's start our chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Chris.
Yeah, hey.
Thanks for having me on.
Yep.
Chris and I have worked together for about 3 years. Chris purchased Mixbus in the early days and helped us define the features and choose some of the features that went into Mixbus. And so he and I have a history with this. But what I can tell you about Mixbus is that it's unlike other recording workstations. I mean, everybody has cut, copy, paste, those kind of features. But what we bring to the table is the fact that we made high-end mixing consoles back when records were made that really sounded great and have stood the test of time. I mean, Harrison consoles were used on records like Michael Jackson's Thriller, like Queen's The Game album, which actually has the song
Another One Bites the Dust.
Another One Bites the Dust. That's the one I'm looking for. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. And AC/DC as well.
Yeah, AC/DC's Back in Black. I mean, some things, really iconic albums that everybody knows about. You know, that was Harrison's heyday. Really, a tremendous number of songs in the 70s and 80s use those Harrison consoles because Dave Harrison was a really great inventor, a really smart guy that came out with this concept of a manufactured mixing console that worked with a tape machine, and he installed those in studios all over the U.S. And so anybody who's making a record would be familiar with Harrison consoles, and some of the best music of all time. Just by chance, we were in the right place at the right time with the right technology, and so you hear that sound everywhere. So our sound kind of permeates the whole audio world. Now, we've been out of the music side of things for a couple of decades, as you say, but it's always been a passion of ours. So we've started to get back into that. But the music business has changed dramatically. Everything's done on a computer. I shouldn't say everything, but computers are less expensive. You can do so much more. And so when we came out with Mixbus, we knew it couldn't be, you know, $1 million console like we can still use the high-end film facilities where they have, you know, big budgets, big projects with hundreds of people working on a project, sort of like the albums used to be made. There were, you know, dozens or hundreds of people that would collaborate on these records with recording engineers and producers and executives, and et cetera, et cetera. That still happens in film.
And record companies that could afford it.
And record companies that could afford it. So we're in a new world now. So we've come out with a computer workstation that anybody can run on their computer, okay? And it's very inexpensive. It's going to be, it's at the time of this video, Mixbus will be released, and it's only $79. So anybody can use this. And what's cool about it is Harrison made this, not a computer company, but somebody that actually was around when these great sounding records were being made. So we have sort of infused Mixbus with all the things we learned out of 40 years of making mixing consoles and recording people in studios. So it's just different. It actually has a console inside there, a console workflow. That's what we bring to the table.
Well, you know, the one of the things that I'd like to talk about is the physical structure of it, or the structure, what it looks like, and also talk a little bit about things like tape saturation, which you have built into this to sort of emulate the sound of the tape machine, which was an important element of the recording process during that time. So why don't you share your screen with us at this point, and we'll take a look at Mixbus and maybe have a little listen to some of the stuff and talk about some of these features.
Okay, after a little bit of technical difficulties, we're now sharing the Mixbus screen.
Yeah.
And what you'll see, this is the main mixer screen. Now, there's also an editor screen like you have in pretty much any other DAW.
Yeah.
Recording workstation. But what you're seeing is something that looks more like an analog console. It looks like a console that you would set up and record in a studio with. So you have, you know, faders at the bottom, and you have here's the big difference is you have a bus structure where the input channels, or your tape playback channels, are over here on the left, and then on the right you have these group buses. I'm showing 4, but there are up to 8 of them, and then you have the master bus on the end. And this allows you to work like people did when they made those great records. Now, computers, when they first came out, weren't fast enough to put something like this on the screen and let you have an equalizer on every channel and all those kinds of things. But computers are, of course, much, much faster now. So we're coming into the game sort of late with a software product, but that means we can take advantage of what computers can really do now. So Mixbus can do things like this. We can have an equalizer on every channel. We can have a compressor built into every channel, and we can have this fixed bus structure that feeds over into buses that have a tape saturation stage to emulate what it used to sound like when you recorded the tape.
Yeah.
And then a master track, which emulates that final 2-track master tape recording. And so by setting up an actual console workflow, you're able to work more like people used to work. You know, if you want to add some low end, if you want to add a little extra oomph to your kick drum, you just reach over and turn up the bass knob. You don't have to click to pop open plug-in windows and all those kinds of things. Now, you can still add plugins to every channel just like you can on other workstations, but you don't need to. There's a huge difference between having to use plugins versus choosing to use them when you want to.
That's right. Yeah, it should be icing, not the actual cake.
Right.
Right. Yeah, and I've been doing that for quite a while. When I first met you, I had purchased over $10,000 worth of Universal Audio plugins and hardware, and I found over time, as I got used to using Mixbus, I used less and less of that because the actual tools that are in Mixbus sound great.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, Universal Audio stuff is great, but
it is great. Yeah,
there's a difference between, like you say, just sitting down and getting your work done. Of course, you might want to add those plugins anytime you want to. You might want to use their reverb, use their EQ, or whatever. But the day-to-day business of sitting down and adding a little bit of heft to your kick drum, you know, and those kinds of things, that's what you just want to have under your fingertips and visible all the time.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I'll talk about visibility. I mean, here's a good example. We have a drum bus over here where we're sending our drums for this mix. And if I want to know which channels are going to the drum bus, I can scan my eyes across this row and see which ones are lit up with the green light. And I know which of my buses, which tracks are getting sent to that bus. And, you know, in other DAWs, it's more of a mix and match approach where you can say, okay, well, this channel will go to that bus and this other channel is going to go to some other buses. And everything gets kind of out of whack. Like there's nowhere you can run your eye down and just see, hey, who goes where? Because you had to assemble it all. And that leaves you the opportunity to get things out of order and make it confusing. And when you're sitting down to work, you don't want it to be confusing. You know, it's really not rocket science. This stuff was worked out and has made some great records for 30, 40 years. You know, we don't need to reinvent all those things. Computers had to reinvent it because computers were so slow back in those days. They had to come up with concepts like in the early days, they couldn't run an equalizer on every channel of the workstation. So they came up with this concept of a plug-in, and they said, we'll give you an equalizer, and you choose which channel you want to put. You can put 2 or 3 of them. That's all you can work. So, you know, that's all that'll fit. So you choose which of those channels that goes on. Well, the world isn't like that anymore. We can now actually emulate a mixing console on the screen and in the CPU. And so that's what we're doing differently. Yeah. So for example, one of the things we've done with Mixbus is you can look at the bus structure. I've got a bus for the drums. That means that I've grouped all the drums into this one fader so that I can adjust the level of the drums together. And if I want to know which of these channels are assigned to my drum group, I can scan my eyes across just like you could with an old console, and I can see which lights are turned on. And I know which guys are going into that drum bus. Now, if you do this on a different workstation, it's up to you to decide which bus goes where, and you have to choose how many buses to make and which channels will be able to go to those buses. And it leaves you a lot of opportunities to make a mistake. And when we're working on music, making our recordings, and we have people in the room looking over our shoulder, and we're trying to do these things quickly. We don't want to leave room for those kind of mistakes. It's really not rocket science. We just want to, boost the bass a little bit, add a little reverb, and sound great. And so we've sort of rebooted this concept of a DAW to make it work just like a console, make it easy and make it fun, and use the computer. I mean, really go ahead and just assign all the features you might need all up front so that everything is right there in front of you.
Sure.
On the left side, you have the input channels. These are your tape playback channels,
Yeah.
And those feed into your group buses. And the group buses have a tape saturation stage, which isn't intended to add wow and flutter or hiss or any of the bad things that tape used to add. What we're doing is they add that means is that a snare drum, for example, has a really loud transient right at the very beginning of the snare drum. And when that was recorded to tape, the magnetic particles just literally couldn't record that loud of a crack, at the beginning of a snare drum. And instead, that was sort of blunted down a little bit so that they could record the ring of the snare drum at a good level. That part got sort of chopped off. And that might sound like a bad thing, but it really isn't. That crack at the beginning of the snare drum, just the very first little piece of the waveform, doesn't serve any musical purpose. What it's doing is it uses up your headroom, and it makes everything sound a little too quiet. So when they record it to tape, everything got that big, full, fat sound. So in Mixbus, you have the option, if you turn up these knobs, of driving a little bit of tape saturation on your tracks. And we have a second stage on the master bus. After you've grouped everything and applied tape saturation to the individual elements, then you apply it again in the master bus, and that is to emulate the 2-track magnetic tape master mix.
Now, because it was a cumulative process, right?
Exactly, and cumulative is the key word here, because it's not just that tape saturation. Once you pass a signal through that tape saturation, it affects how the future stages, like the later compressors and limiters, work as well. So it was a complete workflow. When you recorded your tracks to tape, and then you grouped it through the console, and then you EQ'd and compressed those, the playback of the tape, and then you printed that to your final 2-track, and then you mastered that. There was a flow to that and a process that made those records sound like they sounded. And you can't stumble on that. I mean, that was this process that was created over decades. And so if you want to have that sound that really, it's a joke, but they say you want to make it sound like a record. You want everything to sound like a record. And I don't mean a vinyl record, an album. I mean, there's a sound to those recordings that says to everybody in the world, that's what a polished, finished mix sounds like. And so there's a flow to do that, and Mixbus has that flow baked into it.
Yeah, it really is an important part of the process. Yeah, it is. And the thing it was lost. I mean, I have been working with other digital audio workstations for years, and there was always something missing there. You've got the convenience and you've got a lot of features, but you just didn't have that sound. And it's quite noticeable when you bring someone into the room and you play the same song on 2 different things, and they don't look at it, they don't know the difference. They can really hear the difference.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So do you want to talk a bit about some of the actual features here? Like the difference between version 3 and version 2 is quite striking. I mean, visually, it's quite different.
Yeah, I'll very quickly talk. I think most people who would watch this interview probably weren't familiar with version 2, but I'll quickly bring up some of those points. So 2 of them that I immediately see when I look at the screen is the equalizer and the compressor now occupy little blocks in the signal flow that you can reorder. So I can take this equalizer and put it, after the fader or after the compressor, before the fader. That was something you couldn't do in Mixbus. That the signal flow was fixed, but now you can take these blocks and move them around. And another big difference is that the name of the buses is now printed on each of the bus assign buttons. So I don't have to go and remind myself, oh, what was my the second bus was the drum compressor. I don't have to remind myself that because it gives me a little cue here of what I'm assigning to. So those are some of the cool, simple features that have been added since version 2.
Yeah, but it's really it's really an efficiency thing because you can scan very quickly
you
and
scan your
see.
eyes across. I mean,
Yeah,
another cool, efficient thing that we've added is grouping. If I want to group these 4 together and call it guitars, I can simply click and drag in this black area at the top.
yeah,
I can name that group guitars. And now I have a group. This big blue bar across the top tells me if those are grouped together, and I can bring those up and down together and do all kinds of, convenience features now that those are grouped. And I can turn that group on and off by just clicking on it. So that's one way that we've made things just faster and easier and more modern with Mixbus 3. Mixbus 3 is a 64-bit application now. It uses multiple cores. So if you have a 4, 8, or 12 core machine, we can utilize all those to play back lots and lots of tracks and plug in. So it's just more modern. But why don't I just go down a channel strip
yeah, sure.
for the people that aren't used to Mixbus yet, and we'll look at each of the individual features.
Yep.
Okay, I mean, very quickly, at the top of the channel strip, we have the record button. So you click that to record your track. And then we have buttons that allow you to choose whether you want to listen to the playback or if you want to listen to what you're recording. So I can force it to monitor the input, the microphone, by clicking the in button. Then we have the input section. So I click this button to choose which of my inputs I want to record from. So if I have a 16-channel sound interface, I can decide, okay, I want the 7th channel to feed into this guitar track, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's now a phase button, and if you have a stereo channel, you get 2 phase buttons, so you can invert the left or the right channel separately. And then we have the EQ and compressor and fader, like we talked about, and this black area, which can be resized. If I resize the mixer page, you can get as many channels as you'd like. But that's where I add plugins. So, for example, I've got a de-esser, Harrison's de-esser plugin added in here, so I can open that up. But you can add, whatever plugins you already own, the Waves, Universal Audio, all the brand name plugins that people are familiar with. You can add those in addition to the processing that we've already provided with Mixbus. So below the plugin section, we've got our EQ. So we have a 3-band EQ with sweepable frequencies and a high-pass filter. And then we have our 8 Mixbus assigns, and each of those Mixbus assign sections can have a level control. So if you want to use it as a reverb bus, you can adjust the level to that reverb. Or if you want to use a grouping bus, you just turn it on and it goes to the bus at unity. And then, of course, we have left and right pan. And we have a button that assigns it directly to the master bus, skipping all the 8 mix buses. And you can combine, you can send things to multiple buses at one time. You can send it to the master bus and the reverb bus and the guitar bus and do parallel compression, all kinds of cool tricks that make a record sound like a record. And at the bottom, we have the fader section. And this was very carefully designed. Before we came out with the first Mixbus, we did something that people really, really loved. You have 4 levels of gain control here. Right in a small area underneath your fingertips, you've got the input trim, which happens right at the top of the channel of the signal flow. Before anything else, you have an input trim, so you can boost a signal or cut it down before any of the processing happens. And then you have the compressor. This is the compressor threshold that I can adjust for this channel, and
Okay.
a compressor makeup gain, which happens in the compressor stage. And then you have, of course, the fader, which is the final level. So right in this small area, you've got 4 different ways to affect the volume in different stages of the signal processing. And this is where it really starts to shine, because this gives you all the flexibility you need to make solos pop out and, background vocals sit just right in the mix. I mean, all those kind of things. You've got all the level controls you need right under your fingertips for every channel. And I'm gonna roll just for a quick moment because I want to show the gain reduction. You'll see I'm going to engage the compressor, and you'll see some red lights appear here.
Yep. Bring your volume up a bit.
Okay, let me turn the volume up a little bit. So I don't know how well you could hear that, but you can see the red indicators of the gain compression or the gain reduction for compressors. And I can scan my eyes across here and immediately see the gain reduction happening on all these channels. And with a plug-in based system, that's really hard to do. You have to pop open the window for each of those compressors and keep those open to see what you're doing. And I found as a user that I would very often change a level setting somewhere and everything would start to sound really funny and I couldn't understand what was going on. And when I would go back and reopen that window, I would see that, wow, I'm doing way more compression than I meant to, or way less compression than I thought I was doing because I had hidden that window and it wasn't visible to me anyway. So this keeps everything right in front of you.
This is one of the reasons why I've used other plugins for the fundamentals like compression and limiting and stuff like that. I use them less and less because it takes a lot of time in a mix to get them open, and it takes up a lot of window real estate to do that, where I can actually just do it right there. So, when I go to get a basic mix after we have recorded for the talent to listen to, I'm doing it right there. I'm not using very much in the way of plugins, and I'm doing it for that reason. Now, I do use plugins, as we're getting closer to the end of the mixing process and into the mastering process. I use some of them, but for getting a basic sound, you're right, it's very fast.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would suggest to. And just sit down and get that basic sound. And especially when you're in the room, the more you can do while you're recording to get everything balanced and equalized and sitting in its own space and panned, the more likely you're going to come out with a record that sounds right, because the musicians are hearing the mix being developed as you go, and they can balance themselves against that,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So often when I'm recording someone, I'll ask the band, what their actual setup is on stage, how they want the audience to hear them, so that we can actually create that sense of where the drums are and where the bass is on stage and things like that. And that works out quite well. So what would you like to talk about next here? Now we've gone through the strip. Let's talk a bit about the buses.
Okay. The buses are very similar. They have a slot at the top where you can add the plugins, any plugins that you want to add. This is typically where you would add a reverb if you set up one of your buses as a reverb bus. And then below that, we have some simple tone controls, low, mid, and high. And you'll notice that these have a smaller range than the track EQs. The track EQs are designed for carving your sound into shape, really doing the heavy lifting. If you've got a snare that has too much ring that you don't like, you can use that EQ to cut that out. You can high pass filter things to keep everything out of the bass range except for your bass or kick drum. Now the Mixbus is simpler. It's got a plus or minus 9 dB range instead of plus or minus 15, and it has much wider curves. So now you're doing more sound, overall sound sculpting,
And those EQs are coming in on top of the EQs you've used in your individual tracks, right?
Right. So you're starting to do finer and finer adjustments, and that's part of the workflow. So below that, we have the tape saturation stage. You have a drive knob that I can adjust up or down depending on how much of that drive sound I want. And the tape drive does two things. It rounds off those transients like we talked about. It soft clips those really loud transients that stand out from your music.
Yeah.
And if you drive it really hard, it'll start to add some low frequency distortion like a tape would. And that just adds some sort of density, some harmonic density down in the lower mid range that can make your track sort of, sound louder, sound more present. So that's what that's about. And then we have the master bus assigned. This button decides whether the sound will go to the master bus. If you're using this as like a headphone feed, then you might take it out of the master bus and route this bus directly to somebody's headphones. And then the bottom is just like a channel strip. We have the EQ, the compressor. I didn't talk about the compressor much, but they're actually in the tracks. There are 3 modes. In the mix buses, we have 4 modes, including a new mode that wasn't there before, which is a side chain. I can now feed any or all of these channels into a sidechain bus and use that to drive the compressor on my mix bus. And that allows you to do things like duck the bass guitar when the kick drum with a kick drum, which is a fairly common pop music technique. So we've opened up some opportunities with those kind of some of those things are used more in dance music, but even in regular pop rock and roll music, they'll sometimes use that technique. So we've got 3 modes. We've got a leveler, compressor, and limiter mode on all the compressors. We've revoiced the compressor and the limiter. The compressor is has a new feature. If you click on the compressor, you'll now have this knob becomes a ratio knob, and you can control the ratio of the compressor from very low to very high, and it allows you to get a lot more flavors out of that compressor algorithm. It's a completely new algorithm. The limiter algorithm is also completely new, and it's a brick wall. It's a hard limiter. Wherever you set that threshold, no signal will be allowed to go over that. So you can do a lot more creative effects with drums and things that weren't possible with the previous limiter. So we've really worked on that to give you a very wide range of sounds from these 3 compressor modes that weren't there before.
It gives you sort of a blunt force tool that is audible.
Yeah. The previous ones were designed to be very transparent, because that's very often what we're asked for in the film consoles. But in music, sometimes you want things that sound a little gritty, that sound a little ugly, that sound a little aggressive. So we've left the leveler like it was, because that is the go-to tool for vocals and all kinds of things. But we've hyped up the compressor and the limiter modes to give you a wider range of voicings on those.
Maybe you should change the name of it from Compressor to Roadhouse.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, well, now let's move over now to the master section here and talk a bit about that. There's some very interesting tools here. There's a meter above the tape saturation. Let's talk about that.
Okay, right above the tape saturation stage, there's the K14 meter. Now, this is a meter designed by Bob Katz, who is a renowned mastering engineer. And Bob has been on a crusade for the last maybe 10 years, saying that we have really hurt ourselves in the music industry by trying to make volumes extremely loud on these mixes. And 2 things happen. Firstly, if you make your average level really, really loud, there's no room for the dynamics of the song or of the individual instrument attacks to poke out and grab that person's ear and sound dynamic and sound like a real recording, and you lose some naturalness by mixing everything so loud. The second problem that's come up is that because all these mixes are so loud, various services like Spotify and YouTube, they will now look at the average volume of a mix and bring that mix down to match the other tracks that are playing in that playlist. And if you take a mix that doesn't have any room for dynamics, if you've made it as loud as you possibly could, and then they bring it down to match the other tracks, you're going to sound wimpy compared to tracks that have good dynamics in them. So this meter helps you if you get this meter pointing straight up and down, you're making an average. Your average volume is at minus 14 dBFS, down from full scale, which is a nice loud level, but it won't be, generally speaking, it's not going to be reduced anymore by these online streaming services or by your iPod. Now, if you want to get that aggressive sound that rap and heavy metal use, you can push the volume louder and louder and louder and get into the yellow zone or even into the red zone. But be warned, if you do that, your mixes are going to be brought back down, either by that person's hand on the volume control or by the the music player service, or your pocket music player is going to bring that volume down, and it's actually going to sound wimpy. So we're showing you what level you should put it at, so that your average level still allows some dynamics and gives it some punch and some real, it's going to pop right out of those speakers compared to the mixes that have been made for the last 5, 6, 8, 10 years that were being maximized louder and louder and louder for CD. That's not the world we live in anymore. So this is going to help you get a much better sounding mix. Go ahead.
That's a very important tool. A very important tool. And the little bar on the top of that meter, explain to people what that does. There's a little greeny yellow bar there.
Yeah, that is the stereo correlation meter, or some people just call it a phase meter. And that's indicating how mono compatible your signal is. So, anytime that you have some music, even if it's being heard over a stereo pair of speakers, you need to have some good mono compatibility. For example, in the bass and the kick drum, you want both those speakers to be playing in phase so that you get a good, chest thumping sound out of that.
Yeah.
And so this phase meter gives you an indication. I'm just going to roll this mix for a moment and watch it bounce around a little bit.
Okay.
So we can see on that meter that when the music is playing, it's in the green, sort of on the right side. That means that it's a stereo mix with a good balance of stereo width. Okay, but it doesn't have too much stereo width that it won't come across well when it's mixed down to mono. Now, if it's to the far right and yellow like this, right now we're not playing anything, so silence is showing up as complete mono, as a completely mono signal. And in some cases, you want a mono signal. But if you are making a mix for the radio and you see it completely far to the yellow like that and to the right, you might guess that you've made it too mono. You don't have any stereo width. And if you see it go into the red and towards the left side of the meter, then you know you've made it out of phase and you're not very mono compatible. So this is a last minute check. It's a visual aid to help you make sure you're making a mix that's going to match the stereo breadth of other popular, mixes that are going to be on the radio or on that listener's iPod.
Okay, so let's carry on here. What else have we got to look at here?
Well, in the master bus, the last piece that I haven't talked about yet is the master limiter. So there's a final limiter, and we can see it's a little dark here in the picture, but if I'm going to run the mix and I'm going to boost up the sound so that we start to hit that limiter, you'll see some yellow indicator showing up that we're hitting the final limiter.
Okay. There you go.
So when you do that, it shows you that you're kicking into that final limiter. You're hitting the very loudest that the exported wave file or CD is going to be able to hold. Now, sometimes you may do that intentionally. You can push into that limiter to make the mix, have a louder average level. If you're trying to get louder on the K14 meter, that you could push into that limiter and see more gain reduction happening. It depends on how compressed you've made the tracks before that.
Yeah.
Whether you would want to do that or not. But it gives you a nice bright yellow indication when you hit that final limiter. That's set at -1 dB full scale. So when you start to see those yellow indicators, it means that your mix is pegging the meters essentially.
All right. Well, would you like to go over to the other side of this, which would be your editor, and have a little look at that?
Okay, this is the new Mixbus version 3 editing screen. And just like any other DAW, you can cut, copy, paste. You can time stretch, you can pitch shift, you can move things around, of course, and you can crossfade. Those are all very typical editor features. One of the cool things about Mixbus is that it is a layered editor. And what that means is that it's almost like an image editing app. If I want to copy this piece, for example, that I've just selected, and then paste it somewhere else, now I can grab that piece, and it goes semi-transparent when I move it, so I can see where I want to drop it. And if I wanted to replace, let's say, this drum hit over here, I can drop it right on top. I can crossfade into that and crossfade out of it. And that's an edit that you will not be able to hear. I mean, you can replace drums and all those kinds of things. But the cool thing about it is these layers, the bottom layers remain even after I move this piece on top of it. So if I later want to delete that, you'll still hear what was behind there. And I can actually show you that if I switch over to show the layers in a stacked view. Can you see that, Chris?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
Yeah, you see how I've got my bass track, but let's pretend this was an overdub or a drum, or a place where I had to replace that drum hit. That lays on top of it, but it hasn't cut away what's underneath there necessarily. So that's the layered editing that Mixbus uses. It's very similar to an image editor, and it should be pretty, familiar to anybody who's used to dealing with modern computer editing conventions, cut, copy, paste, all those kinds of things.
Now, how do you get that layered view again? Explain how you get that layered view. You right-click?
Sure. I right-clicked over here on the track header, and I chose layers stacked, and that shows the layers. And of course, I can have multiple layers. I can have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 layers stacked on top of each other. And the way our crossfades work, let me go back to the original view here, zoom in a little bit. The way our crossfades work is that the crossfade fades down to what is underneath this guy. So this is not a fade in and out just for this sound. It's actually a crossfade into whatever is underneath there. So if I stacked another piece on top of that, for example, if I want to drag this and put it on top,
Yeah.
I'm going to adjust my layers here. I'll bring it up. I'll tell that. Let's bring that up to the top layer, raise to top. So I can put that on top of the other guy, and then I can crossfade into this one. Now I've got a crossfade on top of the previous crossfade, so I can stack things as many layers deep as I need to get the sound that I want.
That's amazing.
And other than that, you're going to find it follows all the conventions. This is a digital audio editor that will do everything you need to do. You know, where we've really put our super magic secret sauce is on the editor side, is on the mixer side.
Yeah.
I will quickly mention that this is another new feature. At the bottom of the screen, you can optionally show this this overview.
Yes.
And that shows you all the tracks that are recorded, where they're laid out, and I can pan and zoom around very easily with this. If I want to zoom, I can grab it like that. We've also reinstantiated a feature that a lot of people liked in Mixbus 1 that went away in Mixbus 2, and that is the stationary playhead mode.
Oh, interesting. Okay, and now what purpose does that serve?
Well, it's just for fun, really, but it lets you see the waveform scrolling underneath the playhead, and it, in my opinion, it helps if you're watching over somebody else's shoulder. It just gives a better view. Like if you've got 2 or 3 people in the control room with you, it's easier for everybody to get their head around watching the audio move behind the playhead like that.
Well, you never lose the sight of the playhead for one
You
thing.
never lose sight of the playhead, right? And it's
Yeah.
It's a neat little convention. So we've added that back in.
And how do you make that operate then? How do you actually do that?
Okay, I go to transport.
Yeah.
And there's a checkbox I can turn on or off stationary playhead, and when I do that, then the audio waveforms move underneath the playhead.
Ah, cool. Okay, I'll use that.
Yeah, tons of cool workflow features like that in Mixbus. There are a lot of zooming features. I can zoom to 1 second if I want to zoom in and look at exactly 1 second. I can zoom to the whole session with this pull-down menu without having to navigate to it manually. I can also fit, if I want to fit, let's say 8 tracks on the screen, I can pull that down from the menu and it'll fit exactly 8 tracks. Of course, I can always manually adjust these track heights, and I can always manually zoom in and out. I like to use the trackpad. I hold the command key and the trackpad. I can zoom in and out wherever I want.
Yeah.
But we've got these pull down menus that let you quickly sort of anchor yourself. I'm going to zoom in and look at 1 minute. If that's a time scale I like to look at, I can jump right to that. Something else that's new in Mixbus 3 that's really important, I should probably mention, are the MIDI tracks. So I'm just going to add a MIDI track to this project.
All right.
And I'm going to add in our tone wheel organ instrument that comes with Mixbus version 3. And oops, I meant to add that at the bottom, but I added that after my selection. So here's my new MIDI track, and I can play my instrument. I have a little a MIDI keyboard that pops open. Of course, I would play this with a keyboard, but I don't have a camera set up to show you that.
But yeah, but it was a feature that was not in the other version. You couldn't use MIDI instruments. So
right. Mixbus version 2 didn't have any MIDI keyboard connection at all, and it didn't have virtual instruments. So now we can completely produce a record using virtual instruments and MIDI. I can draw in MIDI notes. I can play them in with a keyboard. And then when I roll through, well, we got too much going on to hear a little bit of B3 going on, but now I can mix and match MIDI and audio and create, arrange songs all right here within Mixbus.
Yeah. Nice feature. I like it.
Well, I think we've summarized all the features, all the new features of Mixbus. Maybe I could just, tell people quickly about how Mixbus was developed. That's something that's unusual about Mixbus.
Yes.
This is actually a collaboration with an open source group of people spread around the world. There's an open source group called the Ardor Workstation. And Harrison had the idea, rather than create our own workstation from scratch and come up with these conventions and keep it sort of our own proprietary thing. We decided to work with this group of people that were already out making a workstation. So we fund their development. We actually offer them money to do anything they want. If they want to add MIDI tracks, they want to add editing. These are people using their creativity to add in exactly what they want Mixbus to do. They have all the source code. They can change it. They can do anything they want. And anybody in the world can join this team and add things to Mixbus. And what we do is, of course, we add our mixer, our DSP engine, all the things that make it sound really great. Okay.
Yeah.
Some plugins that we add on top. Those are the things that we bring to the table. And we feel like that combination is way more powerful than anything else out there right now. This is a very unusual approach to take, but it has worked greatly in our favor, especially going from Mixbus 2 to 3. We've picked up all kinds of features from these open source collaborators. I mean, that includes even the 64-bit operation, the multi-core, MIDI tracks. All those things are things that they developed that we are taking advantage of and using to add our mixer to.
It's an amazing way to develop things, because you're getting feedback directly from people who use it all the time.
Right.
Similar to what you did with me. I'm not a programmer, but I'm a user, and I use it every day. And I, I can say that you guys do listen, and you try to do, you try to implement those things that are going to make my job easier.
Right. Well, we talk to a lot of mixers, a
Yeah.
lot of recording engineers all the time. That's our day job.
Yeah.
Talking to those guys. And really, one of the overwhelming comments we kept getting over the years was, it's just really not that hard. We just want a great sounding EQ. We want the buses laid out like they're supposed to be. The art is in what I do with those tools. It's not, it's not having a lot of a wide variety of tools and you making making my music for me. I don't want a tool that makes my music for me. Mixbus is a tool. We'll capture your music and we'll make it sound like a record. You got to make the music. So we don't pretend to be, the DAW that provides all the loops and all the, and all the sounds. That's not what we're about. You got to make the music. You've got to make the art. We'll capture it and turn it into something that people will recognize as a professional, pop music recording.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's not pre-canned music, which is becoming more and more prevalent now. You actually can make music without actually ever having to have learned music.
Right.
You can't make great music, but you can make music.
Noises, yeah.
Yeah.
So we've marketed ourselves, we're positioning ourselves more towards the traditional musicians like yourself that can really play. You're a guitar player. You bring in, organ players, drummers, bass players. You've got all those guys. They're great friends of yours. They're in your band. This is for people who are in a band. They might record themselves live. They might want to turn those tracks into something they can publish, on an online service. They want to make it sound really good, or they might record in the studio. And yes, you can add some MIDI sounds. If you want to use MIDI drums, that's available. If you don't have a drummer or a great drum kit, it's in there. If you want to add some keyboard sounds, that's in there. If you want to use the MIDI to do some vocal tuning, that's available. But where we focus is on the sound of the mix that you're going to get. No matter where you made those tracks, even if you made them in a different DAW, you can still buy a Mixbus. It's very inexpensive, actually. $79 is what we're going to launch it at as the introductory price.
That's US, right?
US dollars, yeah.
Yeah, that's $3,600,000 Canadian. But that's not your fault. That's the Canadian government's fault.
Well, in any dollars, it's very inexpensive.
Yes.
And it's something that you can have in addition to your other DAW. And what we have seen, what we expect to see more of is, especially now that we have the MIDI tracks in there, is that people will get Mixbus to finish their mixes. And then they'll realize that it does enough of what they want, even on the MIDI side, that it becomes the only tool that they use. And the point is, of course, to make a great sounding record. So if you're going to have to go through Mixbus anyway, the further back you can start the process, the better. So we've added in these MIDI and virtual instrument features so that people can take the process all the way from the very beginning to the final product.
And I'm working on that, something like that right now. I'm working on an original piece of music that we'll use as a demo for the DVD that we'll produce about Mixbus 3.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and I'm finding that it's been very helpful actually just to listen to some of the features, because there'll be some things that I haven't picked up yet that I'll be able to go straight to and use. I like that. You've been very useful, Ben.
Well, I love your music, man. You make some great stuff. So I'm excited. I'm looking forward to the next things we do together. And I hope we'll have another interview like this.
Oh, I'm sure that we will. Now that we've discovered how this all works, this is really a big boom. Actually, I'd like to actually thank Google for coming out with Hangout, because it's made doing this kind of work much easier, right? I mean, it's given what we were using before trying to make this stuff, it makes it a lot easier. So thank you. Thank you, Ben, and I will be talking to you soon.
Great, Chris. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.